Curious about jousting in Lisbon, Portugal in the 1400s? I certainly was after I heard Anton talk at the International Medieval Congress in Leeds this year. And I knew I had to have him on the podcast to talk more about his fascinating work on both what was unique about jousting in Lisbon, as well as some exciting theories behind the birth of the tilt. Welcome to the Schola Equestris podcast, your podcast for mounted combat, classical dressage, and the history of horsemanship. I am very excited today to share with you my discussion with António Oliveira, also known as Anton Stark. No relation whatever to either Game of Thrones or Iron Man. He has been researching arms and armor for a few years now, specifically focusing on late medieval Portuguese arms and armor. He is a current PhD student at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, working on a project titled The Harness in Portugal, 1370 to 1495. And on top of that, he is a historical reenactor. Okay, Antonio, are you ready to get started?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to begin with our rapid fire questions here. So short answers. First one is, where in the world are you located?
Okay, so I'm Portuguese born and bred, and at present I live in Coimbra, which is the lovely city of students and the birthplace of the first dynasty of Portuguese kings.
That's right. And how did you become interested in the history of jousting in Portugal?
Well, I mean, what little boy doesn't want to be a knight when they're young? Or girl? And as I managed to find my way into researching what Portuguese knights got to wear on the battlefield, I also took the opportunity to sort of delve into what they did to pass the time, and that includes jousting.
Excellent. So do you ride yourself? Do you have horses, or have you ever jousted before?
I don't ride yet. My experience with jousting is all secondhand. I'm friends with a few knights in training, such as my friend Martin Gervais, and I know I'll get to learn and experience everything one day, perhaps very soon. But for now, sadly, no horses for me yet.
That's okay. Well, I appreciate saying the yet, because one thing I like to emphasize on this podcast is that it's never too late to start. Pursue those dreams, right? And learn to ride and do mounted combat or jousting or whatever your interests are. So I'm in full support.
That's all in the cards, definitely.
So what sort of history things do you like to do for fun then?
Well, I'd have to say reenactment. What I love the most is being able to bring to life the things I research by recreating them. So historical reenactment gives me one hell of a kick in that regard, and I'm sure that once I bring the Horsey component into it, I'll just have extra fun.
And is that 15th century reenactment, or what's your favorite time period?
Well, mostly 15th century. I do other periods as well, which I know we shouldn't, because we spread ourselves too thin across several periods, but mostly and mainly 15th century. Yeah.
Very good. And if you could go back in time and visit, we'll say, one historical person, who would that be?
Well, it's always difficult to choose just the one, but I keep coming back to King Afonso V of Portugal, and not just because, he's Portuguese. It's just that from the sources, the guy genuinely seemed like a good person, for his time. I think it'd be interesting to have a drink with him, I wager.
I agree. I think that's a great answer, particularly given your study, what you study and your interests. Tell us now a little bit about, I know obviously you've already said it's 15th century, but tell us a little bit more about the specific location you're studying and sort of what specific area.
I study Portugal, especially mid to late 14th century up until the very early 16th century. Sometimes I go a little bit further, sometimes I go a little bit back, but that's in terms of chronology, that's my mainstay. And it's strange that for such an old country, Portugal's history is still mostly unknown to foreigners, but to ourselves as well. Which is a damn shame, if nothing else, because of what our culture and society looked like back then, at least the glimpses we can get from the sources. We're talking about a small yet extremely diverse rectangle of land by the sea, which is Christian, but also a little bit Jewish and a tiny little bit Muslim. Exotic would be the word, especially when we compare it to the plainer, if I may put it like that, English/French/German Middle Ages we've all grown to accept as the standard for the Middle Ages in common perception.
Right. Well, as an American, I take no offense to that. I agree. I think, many of my listeners who are big horse history fans, of course, they all know Dom Duarte. But often that's maybe the only thing they know. Of course, there's a very rich history in Portugal that I agree that many of us are less familiar with.
It's difficult because we don't have that many sources, and in fact, particularly in the topic of jousting, sources are very limited. They are what few sources we have great details, so they do lend themselves to an in-depth analysis, but there are very few of them, and that's true of sources for most anything when it comes to Portuguese medieval history. There's exceedingly few sources left after, the 1755 earthquake, the French invasions, and district archives burning down or being scattered to the four winds in the 19th century, and, simple neglect that occurred everywhere in Europe, and wanton destruction. So,
right. How did you come upon the source or sources that you are using? They're part of the city archives of Lisbon, correct?
Some are part of the city archives, the municipal archives. Others are part of the royal chanceries, which are preserved in the national archives, called Torre do Tombo. And they're mostly in these two institutions, and then we also have some mentions in Portuguese chronicles, particularly the chronicle of King Gschwend I, and also King Gschwend II, although that's for a later period.
Okay, so you've done sort of a mix of cross-referencing what you found in the city archives with then Portuguese chronicle, other historical sources to sort of fit together what we now think jousting in Lisbon might have looked like.
Yeah, because no one source or no one group of sources can give you enough information to create an image, or enough of a clear image of jousting in Lisbon as it existed.
Right.
That is always the problem with medieval sources in general for any region in Europe, but for Portugal especially, because we have so few sources. We do have to cross-check them with all other sources, because we're only one source only gives you a tiny bit of the puzzle, a few pieces scattered here and there. Other sources give you some more pieces of the puzzle, and at the end, you won't end up with the finished puzzle. You will end up with something which you can tell the image the puzzle was meant to give you, but you will see holes here and there.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about what you have found then. Yes. Let's launch into it. We're talking about jousting in Lisbon specifically. So what appears to be different or unique about what was happening in Lisbon compared to some of the other big cities around Western Europe?
I'd say the biggest difference for me, it's two differences. It's the place where jousting occurs, where it's held, and who takes part in it regularly. So in England, in France, in Germany, in Italy too, for the most part, we expect jousters to be noblemen, to be knights. It's part of the uniform. What happens in Portugal, and especially in Lisbon, is that the sources tell us that most jousters were urban aristocracy, non-noble urban elites, so they were not knights. When we're talking about urban elites, we're talking about merchants who had loads of wealth and had a social ladder to climb, but we're also talking about local officials who sort of bridge the gap between the courtly world and the local spheres of power, this especially in Lisbon. We're talking about overseers, we're talking about judges, magistrates, treasurers, you name it. And in that regard, Lisbon can be compared to other locations in Europe where local urban elites competed toe-to-toe with the aristocracy for prominence and power, and therefore also competed with them or alongside them in their martial displays. We know, for example, that non-nobles competed in jousting in Florence. We know that this also occurred in the Burgundian territories, particularly Bruges, with its White Bear fraternity or confraternity, and in Lille, which had the jousting feast of the Epinettes, which took place during Lent. So these places also shared similar jousting practices and contexts to those of Lisbon in the 14th and 15th centuries. Yet, even compared to those places, jousting in Portugal, at least, again, from what sources we have, seems to have been more of a hobby for the upper echelons of the people, as it were, at least until the mid-15th century. Then we have a shift in attitudes towards jousting. We may ask ourselves why these people specifically, but one thing we have to keep in mind when discussing the Middle Ages is that often we can't easily get a this because of that answer, because some processes take decades or even centuries to coalesce into concrete reality. And that is precisely the case when the question is, why are non-nobles jousting like that? We'd have to go all the way back to the 12th century to start explaining that particular phenomenon. I'm not sure if we have the time. I'd be happy to explain it if we do. But what matters for our discussion right now is these people jousted, and they jousted a lot, and they were expected to joust. And we have sources pointing specifically to that there was an expectation that these people jousted.
So it was a mixture of who we would normally think of as jousting, so knights or landed elite, plus this whole other extra group of basically, it sounds like the people who could make it happen, who had the money for the horse and the armor and show up. Is that right?
Well, that's the curious thing. We would expect these people to have their own equipment, to have their own horses, and to a certain extent that is true. We know that these people, because of their wealth, they were required to own arms and armor. We even know of some of the items they owned in specific points in time. For example, we have a list from 1420 which details a whole lot of equipment which was commandeered by the king to be sent to the newly conquered fortress of Ceuta in northern Africa, which had been conquered in 1415, and a small garrison had stayed there, and it could only be supplied from the mainland. So the citizens of Lisbon lent their arms and armor for this this expedition, for one of many relief expeditions. So we know what they lent, and these were decent quality pieces they had. The typical, the bassinets, but for example, some of them are plain bassinets, others are described as having gilt trimmings or aventails with brass edging, richly decorated vambraces, nice three-part or composite breastplates, So they were required to own arms and armor. Usually they were required to own horses if they were rich enough. But most people in Portugal who were required to own horses complained a lot about having to own a horse, especially those who lived in cities, because they would argue, and in a way quite rightly, we don't have the space to keep them, we don't have enough ground for them to feed on. And so in loads of places in Portugal throughout the 15th century, you see Portuguese kings telling them, okay, don't have a horse, but have two harnesses instead. So you can have one yourself and lend the other one out. That sort of clashes with the idea that there were always horses at the ready for these festivities for jousting, because these were taking place all the time, apparently, according to the sources. So there was an expectation for them to have arms and armor and to have horses, but we don't know where they kept the horses. And we also know that there was jousting equipment, both armor and lances and other objects, stored in Lisbon's royal storehouse. And when first hearing this, one might think, okay, but these might be the king's own effects for jousting. But no, kings and princes and other seigneurs all had their armories in palaces throughout the kingdom. And Lisbon's royal storehouse was specifically conceived to store equipment to equip the royal host, to equip the Portuguese Navy, and to be accessed by everyone in times of need. So, for example, in the late 14th century, in 1384, when Lisbon is besieged by a Castilian army, everyone rushes to the storehouse to grab stuff, because that's what it's there for. So when we see jousting equipment in the storehouse, that jousting equipment definitely does not belong to anyone from the court who resides in Lisbon, because those, the king and the royal family, all have their stuff in palaces. So the only assumption that can be made is that those pieces are available to be lent out whenever there is occasion for them to be lent out, and then they're returned to the storehouse.
When you say jousting equipment, how do you know it was armor that was intended for jousting?
Some of it is described specifically as jousting equipment. So, for example, I recall that there's one. It's actually, I think, the first recorded instance of one specific word, which is gibanet, which is it's a brigandine, but it's the type of the normal 15th century brigandine. So it's brigandine with a lance rest, and it says that it's specifically for jousting. So we have that. We also have lances, vamplates, and rockets, and I think one or two other pieces which are described specifically as for the joust. I think gauntlets for the joust as well. So we know there was specific equipment for jousting there.
That was in the king's storehouse, basically. So you mentioned they were doing a lot of jousting. So this was happening regularly. Was this for festivals, marriages? Who paid for this, or how was? Do you know anything about that?
Yes. Well, we do know they had two very common excuses to hold to hold jousts in Lisbon. The first one was royal entries. So it's actually the first mention, chronologically, we have of a joust taking place in Lisbon is a joust in the 1360s. It was recorded in a chronicle written in the early 15th century, but the writer wasn't making it up just for effect. We know that took place. So in the 1360s, we have a source telling us that there was this merchant called Afonso André, and he was jousting in the Rua Nova. And I think the quote goes something like, as was usual when kings came to the city, or to a city, that the merchants and citizens jousted with those of the court in celebration. So we have royal entries as one excuse to hold jousts, and the other big excuse was weddings, of course. Apparently in Lisbon, it was the custom for jousts to be held whenever the daughter of a knight or the daughter of a citizen, so an urban patrician, was to be married. There was jousting, and there was another game, which is called tabuado, a game in which the riders try to bring down a castle made of planks by throwing a spear at it. So jousting and tabuado, those are the two main games until the mid-15th century. And we have other sources corroborating this as well. For example, there's an entry in King João I's Livro de Montaria, which again, great source to be translated into English. No one's done it already. No one's done it yet. The Livro de Montaria is a hunting treatise, but he also refers a lot to riding techniques. And at one point, he's telling us that he's directing these advices to young knights, and he's telling them hunting isn't like a jousting course in Lisbon, in the Rua Nova. Hunting is more of a preparation for war than jousting in the Rua Nova. And he refers to, again, weddings, royal entries, and other occasions.
That's a great segue, mentioning sort of war versus something for fun. So do we know anything about the lances they were using, the equipment? Was this a joust of war, joust of peace? Do we know anything specific about like the coronels?
Well, going by later sources, because for these sources in the late 14th century, early 15th, we have nothing of that kind. But going by later sources, apparently it was always jousts of peace in Lisbon. And it sort of makes sense. I mean, especially if you're holding a joust as a celebration for a wedding, you don't want anyone getting killed by accident, so you're going to make it as safe as possible. But then that also begs the question, if it's a joust for peace, the equipment usually is more expensive because it is specialized equipment. It's not just what you have at home for war. So and this ties to your earlier question, sorry, I just recalled, who is paying for this? So, okay, there are pieces for jousting, there's equipment for jousting in the royal storehouse, but who's paying for that? I don't think, wedding celebrations would have been paid by the municipal council because they are private affairs. Royal entries should have been paid by the municipal council, although we have no records whatsoever that mention it. But we do have, for example, a letter from 1402 from the municipal council asking João I if they can remove something called esteios, so some sort of stone bollards or something from the Rua Nova, because there are always activities taking place there, equestrian activities, and the horses are always tripping on these esteios, and so everyone gets injured, riders and mounts. So this letter shows the municipal council's concern regarding jousting. It shows that they're paying attention to these events and trying to get the king to regulate some aspects of how the city works. to make jousting safer. So we can't say for a fact that municipal council paid for some of these jousts, but they were certainly paying attention to how they took place, when they took place, and it's more than likely that they contributed with some money as well.
Okay. Well, then let's talk about the Rua Nova, since I think that plays in so much to our discussion, and of course why a city council would care. So, as you know, you've talked about in your talk, this wasn't jousting outside the city like we see in a lot of France or Burgundy, where it's a big set up in a huge open land. This was in the middle of the city, as is done in some other places. But tell us specifically about the Rua Nova. What's special about it?
Yeah. So the Rua Nova, the new street, was by far Lisbon's largest, most spacious street, and it was sort of a showcase of the city. In fact, King Afonso V called it the best and most important thoroughfare in the city. So we know that for jousting to be held, the requirement is a space of at least 50 to 100 meters in length and a couple of meters in width, so enough for two horses to safely pass side by side. I'm sorry if I'm sticking to meters. I could do the conversion, but...
No, don't bother. We're the problem.
So the Rua Nova was over 200 meters in length, so twice a really long jousting course. And it has a maximum width of, I think, 8.8 meters at its widest point. And I must highlight at its widest point. So on paper, it made for an ideal stage for this type of activity. You would have people watching from houses either side of the street, or standing on the doorways, or leaning against the pillars and columns, which formed the ground floor for most of these houses, which we know is the case from some later sources which describe houses in the Rua Nova. So if you can imagine, the buildings would be bedecked in silks and brocades and colored fabrics during these festivities. It must have been quite the sight. But a street is not a street. A street is not a square. If I'm going to put it like this, a street is not a square. A street isn't an open field. We don't know, for example, if the street was level. Probably was, but so we don't have any sources on that. So let's put that to the side. But we must take into account other characteristics which might have made jousting in Rua Nova different from jousting in other places. For example, you have houses either side and they jetty over the street itself. So if you're a mounted rider, you're already on top of the horse with your lance held aloft before you charge. That reduces the available width from 8.8 to perhaps 8 or 7 in some points, 8 or 7 meters in some points. And the street itself, if we look at maps of it, the street itself was not completely straight. So it was mostly straight, but then it twisted and angled and turned slightly in some corners, leaving just enough space for the lists, but creating some visual, sometimes perhaps literal, such as these esteios, obstacles either side. So not a bad place in which to hold a joust, but perhaps not the best solution ever, at least when you compare it to large open squares or large open fields.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, I think, for most of us today, what that would have felt like. Because those of us who do joust, I mean, it's often in a, big open space. Everything is, well sectioned off away from the onlookers. And, of course, we have modern safety concerns. And I can only imagine people, leaning out of windows and off rooftops watching this take place.
Definitely. It wasn't... that's another aspect that I would love to learn more about, but we just don't have the sources, because we know in other places you have people watching from rooftops, falling from rooftops. But who is sort of setting up the event? Again, is it the municipal council? Is it someone else? Who is setting up these events? Who is telling people, warding people back from the nights? Who is doing essentially is taking care of security and safety during these events? I would love to learn more about it, but unfortunately, the sources don't mention that even once.
And then, of course, part of the challenge with your research is that we can't see the street today. Correct? It's gone.
Yeah, it was completely destroyed, completely obliterated by the 1755 earthquake. Actually, it's one of those streets. Some streets in Lisbon, they were rebuilt, but you still have a few traces of them here and there. But the Rua Nova was so close to the river that it's one of those streets that just was completely wiped out, and then completely built over during the subsequent rebuilding efforts in Lisbon. We know what its layout was like, not only because we have charts and maps from before the earthquake, but also there were archaeological excavations during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So we know exactly what its layout looked like. That's why I kept insisting on 8.8 at its widest point, because sometimes it narrows, not too much, but still a decent amount, and sometimes it also, at least one of its ends during the mid 15th century, was widened a bit as well. But sadly, we simply can't know what it looked like. We have a couple of 16th century depictions of it, including 2 paintings which were identified in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, and they're in the Kelmscott Manor collection in England. But they are much too late to help us definitely with what the street looked like at the turn of the 15th century.
Well, maybe we'll get lucky someday, and someone will release, from their private collection or something, some picture of it in the 15th century. There's hope.
There's always hope. Yeah.
So let's then talk about the birth of the tilt, which I think is some of the most exciting sort of area of your research, what you've put together. So when did you first find evidence of the barrier tilt being used in Lisbon?
So again, we're back to the problem with sources. We don't have any Portuguese sources mentioning tilts until I think the first mention of the tilt is either in 1450 or very, very late in the 1490s. But that's a Portuguese mention. The first records we have of the tilt in Lisbon are from 1428, and this is according to an anonymous Burgundian ambassador who visited Portugal in 1428 to fetch Princess Isabel of Portugal for her to be brought to Burgundy after her marriage by proxy to Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about the ambassador's description of events is that the tilt seems such a novelty to him that he can't even identify it by name. He instead describes it in great detail because, well, it is a novelty. So this suggests that, on the one hand, for the Burgundians, in 1428, the tilt is something completely unheard of, whereas for the Portuguese, it was already a tried and true concept by then. And then we have other sources which go directly in with that line of reasoning, which support this idea.
So does that then suggest that the tilt started in Portugal, or maybe even started in Lisbon? What's your theory right now?
Okay, so my theory sort of pieces together everything we've discussed so far with a few testimonies, including this from the anonymous Burgundian ambassador. So if we briefly recap our discussion so far, what we have is repeated and continuous jousting in Lisbon, taken part in by people who weren't, as adroit or as practiced or as well versed in jousting as knights were supposed to be, and who probably didn't have the best equipment either. Who had to use secondhand stuff or lend stuff from the storehouse or from someone else. And all of this was taking place in the street instead of a square or some sort of other open space. We know that jousting in Lisbon was prone to accidents, either because of the jouster's lack of ability, or because of the way the Rua Nova was set up, or because of other factors which are unknown to us. In my view, Lisbon, more than any other place in Europe at the time that I'm aware of, I always have to stress that I'm aware of, necessitated the creation of a barrier that helped these amateur jousters avoid crashing into each other. And we know that that's precisely what the tilt does. The tilt is there to avoid, as far as anyone can, to avoid horses crashing into one another, as well as help guide the knights along their course and help with targeting and everything else. So that's one part of the explanation why I think Lisbon necessitated this. But we could also argue, okay, but jousting also took place in other cities in Europe. I mentioned Bruges, I mentioned Lille, I mentioned Florence, and although it wasn't common, every now and then it could take place in somewhere else like Paris or some other Italian cities. The thing is, in the world of jousting and its limited sources, never have any other suspects been put forward other than Iberia or Italy. We know that the tilt definitely didn't appear in Central Europe because we have extensive sources for France, for England, for Germany, and they never mention the tilt until a certain date. And when they do, they specifically mention the tilt as something new. Oh, we saw the French doing this in the 1440s, and this looked cool, let's copy it. So it's always, we only have two geographical regions from which the tilt could have arrived. So I'm putting Lisbon forward not only because it belongs to one of these regions, but because there's circumstantial evidence. And then we also have the witness testimony, as I like to call it.
So if we dumb it down, basically in Lisbon, they were kind of doing janky jousting. So, maybe borrowed horse, borrowed equipment, probably didn't get to train as much. Some of them were merchants. They're on a narrow street. I'm imagining cobblestones, and it's maybe not straight. And yeah, it's a very intense, narrow setting. And as you said, then, so accidents were happening, injuries occurring, and
yes,
someone somewhere in Lisbon had the good idea to create a barrier, basically, and thus it starts.
Yes. Yeah, especially if we look, again, there are some other circumstantial evidences which I didn't include in my talk in Leeds this year when I first talked about the subject. For example, the tilt itself, how it was originally conceived, because nowadays we always think of the tilt as a wooden barrier, but the original tilts are just a piece of cloth stretched between the riders in the middle of the lists. So that's as makeshift as it comes.
Yeah, that's right.
It's nothing fancy. Later on, it would become really fancy, as we know. Really solid structures covered with brocades and the arms of the jousters or the arms of whoever is sponsoring the event. But a simple piece of cloth stretched in the middle of a field, or in this case, a street. Again, it's improvisation.
Right. And you mentioned that the one Burgundian record had a pretty detailed depiction of what the tilt was like. So you're saying it was cloth. Any other details about its construction or how high it was or anything like that?
No, that's the thing. Initially, we know it was cloth because it appears in other sources, for example, Castilian sources. By 1428, it was already a wooden structure.
Okay.
We know that because that ambassador describes it, and then later on, so when Princess Isabel is already in Burgundy, this being, it's a ducal wedding, but we might as well call it a kingly wedding because it's the Dukes of Burgundy.
Yeah, right.
So we know that the wedding celebrations lasted for weeks, months, and there were jousts held in Burgundy. And one of the witnesses to these jousts was Jean Lefebvre, the Lord of Saint-Rémy, who was also a chronicler. He was actually the first sort of herald of the Golden Fleece, which was created by Philip the Good in honor of his wedding to Princess Isabel.
Right.
And he describes, again, he has no name for the tilt, but he specifically describes how it's built. I actually have the source here somewhere. Oh, here it is. He says that, and I quote, "On Saturday there were jousts after the Portuguese fashion, and all the barriers that had been set up in the square were taken down." So they already had barriers for other events. I take it maybe the melee. All the barriers that had been set up in the square were taken down. So they put up a single barrier across it, a very strong wood, high up to the shoulders of the horses, and it was covered with blue cloth all the way around. So again, for him, the tilt is something completely uncommon or new. So we have these two sources which attribute to the Portuguese. So this is the Portuguese fashion, doing it with a tilt. And by 1428, it's already a solid wooden tilt made of planks covered with something. But we do have another source, which so we're sort of working backwards here. Usually we go from a larger space to a smaller space. So we already have the attribution to Lisbon, to the Portuguese, because if it happens in Portugal, it happens in Lisbon. So we have the attribution to Portugal, but then how do we know that the tilt could have been narrowed down to Iberia in the first place? And for that, we look to the chronicles of a man called Gutierrez Diaz de Games, who was a companion and the chronicler of the feats of the Castilian knight Pero Niño. And it tells us that when Niño was in France at the French court as a guest in 1407, Games writes that the French joust after another fashion than that followed in Spain. He uses the term Spain, meaning the entire Iberian Peninsula, because Spain as a country didn't exist back then. So it just groups together all the Iberian kingdoms, Spain.
Right.
So apparently the French jousted without lists and strike after the fashion of war. So again, in Iberia, things are without lists, without tilt. So in Iberia, we have a tilt and it's a joust of peace. In France, they don't have tilts, and it's a joust of war. So Games is writing this in the 1440s, but it's clear from the context. When we just look at the text, he's clearly describing things that were taking place in 1407 as well. So apparently from 1407 to the 1440s, at least in his consideration, the reality was that the French jousted with war equipment and without tilts, and the Spanish did the other way around.
Got it. Are there any, as you continue to do this research, are there any mysteries left about jousting in Lisbon that you're hoping to find Anything you're still really hunting for the answer for?
Well, as I said, for example, I would like to know who pays for stuff. I keep on going to even to later books that we have left from the municipal management and whatnot, to see if I can find some document which describes how feasts, how jousts are organized, that may shed some light on how they used to take place, how they used to be organized in the 14th and 15th centuries. Sometimes you find the weirdest things in archive sources. Sometimes you're looking at an 18th century book, and it is a transcription of long lost 15th century documents which you had no idea existed. So those are very pleasant surprises sometimes to have. And there are plenty of those still out there. The problem is just finding them, because as soon as someone finds them, everyone gets to know about it, of course. So that's one aspect I would like to look at. I would also like to look at where equipment is coming from. That's also part of my PhD, because Portugal doesn't really have an armour industry. It's very much what I'd call the literal definition of a cottage industry. So most arms and armour were imported from abroad. So who's making the lances? Who's making, especially in the 15th century, when equipment becomes very specialized and very expensive, who's making the lances? Who's making the armour? Who's making the helmets? This is something I would love to learn a bit more about.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it sounds like it's a little bit of a hodgepodge in terms of the armor. I guess it was whatever was available for the people who didn't own it, whatever was available in this storehouse. So it sounds like it would also be interesting to discover how it actually even got to the storehouse. Was it purchased by the city? Was it someone dies and they give their leftover armor to the city, or surely there's some sort of story behind how some of it gets there.
Yeah, but most of these stories, unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever get to know, because most of the archival sources we have for Portuguese stuff, as I said, were destroyed. I mean, the only reason we even have a national archive, it has nothing to do with jousting, but I might as well share the story. The only reason why we have a national archive is because the archive keeper, after the 1755 earthquake, so the archive was in one tower in Lisbon's Castle of St. George. The tower fell during the earthquake. So we have chancery books scattered all along the hill. And the record keeper, the archive keeper, what he did was he immediately went, I have to pick these books up, I have to pick these books up. And he saved the National Archives. And even then, we lost a part of them.
Wow.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have a thing.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So, but for example, we lost everything that could have told us something about jousting that was located, for example, in the royal palace itself, so downtown by the river, all gone.
Wow.
Puff of smoke.
So, of course, I know you're a PhD student, right? So this is an ongoing project. Where are you kind of looking at next in your research, or are there things that you're still sources you're still going through, or is this something we're going to get to read about shortly?
In terms of my PhD, yes, I plan on finishing my thesis in about 2 years tops. Ideally next year, but I think I have too many archive sources still to go through, so that'll take me a little bit of time. So I have to finish it, and then I have to translate it. So I have to beg everyone's forbearance whilst I do that. But I like to plan long term, and ideally, I would like to have it out in English in about 3-4 years' time, tops. But I keep on publishing papers on several related topics, or even bits of my PhD and other topics as well. They'll be coming out much sooner than that. I've already published a few things. I would like to publish on this idea of Lisbon as the birthplace of the tilt. I haven't yet found a venue or a decent structure for the paper, but ideally I would like to publish on it soon if I can, just to get the idea out there.
Of course. Well, what you've done is incredible. The research you've already done on this topic, and I really, really enjoyed your lecture you gave at Leeds last month, and I know everyone else did too. So I'm really excited to see you develop this and get to publish it. And I know my listeners will be very interested in it, because we like to hear new things, right? stuff we don't already know.
Yes.
So this is very exciting, and I'm sure some of them will want to reach out to you about various details or sources. Anything else you want to share with the listeners before we wrap up?
Yes, I think I have something they would like to hear. So this is specifically for the jousting community, or anyone interested in jousting, really. So next year or so, maybe 2 years, who can say, I'll be collaborating with my good friend and colleague Paul Dias in studying and publishing in English for the first time ever the wedding celebrations of Prince Afonso of Portugal in 1490, including some very, 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 very nice tidbits on jousting, presentation of knights, pageantry, and the like. So I'd say be on the lookout for that, even though it's going to take a little while. But for anyone who loves jousting, at least there isn't much on horses there, because it's all based on a chronicle written by a man who clearly couldn't care less about the act of jousting itself. His only interest was everything before and after jousting, but which also makes part of the spectacle. So we have those details in abundance. But for the jousting itself, we only know, and the king won everything.
It's important.
It's important, as usual.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. I will share some of your information, and you gave me some details on how to contact you. You mentioned you'll be hopefully at Leeds next year, 2025.
I'll do my best. Yes.
Perfect. Yes, I know we're going to have a big equestrian section next year, so which is still actually open for submissions for anyone who happens to be interested. And maybe we'll also see you at Feldlager 2025.
Again, doing my level best to be there.
Excellent.
I already missed once. I don't want to miss twice.
Oh, yes. You won't want to miss that, I promise. Very good. You can find Anton on Instagram at Sir Anton Stark, as well as on Facebook if you search Anton Stark. I know he would be happy to have anyone reach out and talk to him or ask more questions about his research. Hopefully we'll see him next year at Feldlager or at the IMC in Leeds in July. Our next podcast episode will be out in August. In the meantime, you can find us on Facebook, the Schola Equestris podcast, or on Instagram, as well as our website, www.scholaequestris.com. You can find our podcast on all of the typical podcast places, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Google Podcasts. So please give us a follow and a like so that we can continue to share this with others. Until then, happy writing.